Chats with Bud and Sue.
Yay!
Today we want to follow up on the two-part video series that we put together called Redecorate Your Soul. And in that series we talked about how to create an off-ramp for destructive and unhealthy repetitive thoughts and behaviors that are impacting your relationships and the quality and health of your relationships. So we want to follow up on that today and talk more about identity and the sources of healthy identity and the sources of unhealthy identity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to add anything from the last, your thoughts?
Oh, goodness. Well, I think that I really just like the idea of the off-ramp, that if we get so focused on the repetitive behavior itself, that becomes the driving force, and our entire energy is put towards, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this. So I really like this concept of giving us tools to open up that destructive cycle that we get stuck in, and as you're so aptly putting it, the off-ramp. So this is a continuation of how we access that off-ramp, correct?
That's it.
Yahoo! Let's do it.
So let's build off of that together. So many times we think our unhealthy emotions are creating the unhealthy behavior, but what's really happening is embedded in our identity is what I like to call I am beliefs. And these are unhealthy beliefs that are imparted to us. Those unhealthy beliefs that we are identifying with is what creates the unhealthy emotion. So by unhealthy emotion, I mean anger, bitterness, anxiety, depression, and it makes us very reactive. It's kind of like, these emotions are kind of like the hot stove when we touch our hand to, and we react to that. And that reaction has very negative impacts on our relationships and our life. It actually causes us to be attracted to the very unhealthy things that we're trying to avoid. Mm-hmm. And Jesus talked about this in the Gospels. He said, you know, what causes unhealthy words to come out of our mouth, that they come out of your heart. They don't come out of your mouth. They actually come out of your heart, what's in your heart. And so that's what we want to talk about today. Kind of this build on the last videos about how to kind of renew our thinking and our hearts and our whole identity. And so again, the first point to take away here is that out of our identity springs healthy or unhealthy things in our life. And that's important to remember, because remember, health brings life and unhealth brings sickness. It taints everything. And we can feel so stuck in the pain of that we have no idea how to get out of it. We just are so stuck, we lose our hope. And so Sue and I are hoping that we can bring you some things that will renew your hope and give you some spiritual tools to climb out of that pit of hopelessness and rediscover some new things that will bring life to you. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I want to talk about first is this concept of inherent value. So value that is in me, that cannot be taken away. That's what I mean by inherent value. It just is the truth. Versus the way we many times in today's world, we're earning and seeking value outside of ourselves with the money we make or how we're viewed on Facebook or Instagram. And it actually creates this very fragile sense of self and value. And underneath that is a real sense of vulnerability, because we actually know how fragile it is. Mm-hmm. And so I want to talk about that as well as we start talking about some things from the Bible here. And then I want to end today with how we have a healthy identity and how we can embrace this inherent sense of value within the self. Where does that come from, and what blocks that from us? So, anything you want to add to that before we dive in?
I just want to say this. I think it is, we said this in the last video, this is everyone's struggle, because if we're in a world system that is reinforcing this idea that our value comes from what accomplishments we've had, our degrees, college degrees, our, the things that give us all the kudos in the world, right? Whether you're the nurse or the doctor or the whatever. And I think that for myself, when I was so sick and, I put all my value earning in what I did, and then when all that stopped, boom, I couldn't do a thing. That was when I had really a crisis of, oh, wait a minute, really, what is my value? If I can't give anything to anyone anymore, then do I really have value? So this is core to understanding how to get on that off-ramp you were talking about. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
So we're going to start out of the scriptures in 2 Corinthians. Do you mind reading that?
No, love to. So this is 2 Corinthians 4:4, and it says, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God.
Right. Now, this passage is so important to our understanding of this, because it talks about the God of this age, okay? Now, from a spiritual perspective, this is an evil influencer. Think about like on Instagram or Facebook, right? If somebody's on there and they're deceiving people and they're convincing people that they're worthless with all of their talk and their words. Now, this is the exact same concept that Paul is talking about here. The God of this age that we live in, it's a political statement about the God of this age. So what the Bible describes here is really two families or kingdoms that are in conflict with each other. You have the God of this world or this age with his system, and when Jesus came and gave himself as a sacrifice for many, he established a second family or kingdom here that is come to set people free from the deceptions of this age. So, and
Can I just clarify something? Because
Sure.
you said it was a political system. And so oftentimes I think we get in our minds political meaning two parties. That's not what you're talking about. So can you just give us a little bit more on what is that broader definition of a political system? Like who's in control?
yeah,
essentially?
it has to do with almost a form of government and power is what I mean by that.
Okay.
And Sue's right, it's not Democrats versus Republicans or conservatives versus liberals. It's nothing like that at all. We see this manifested, especially today, in politics.
Sure.
But there's a spiritual root and an identity root to all of that.
Okay.
And this is important. He's talking about blinded. So we're talking about deception here, that we can't see things correctly and clearly, and that leads us into very dangerous places in our hearts and our minds, and how we think of ourselves and other people, and how even we think of God. And that's why this passage here in 2 Corinthians, it talks about this, what is it that they're blinded to? They're blinded to the light. And so think about walking around in complete darkness, all the dangers of that. But Jesus is the light of the world. He came to illuminate who we are and who God the Father is, And he came to lead us back to the Father and our true identity as his children. That's why he came, to express the love of the Father and lead us back to that. And so this is the blinding that we're talking about. It's a blinding to who I really am, and it's a blinding to the true nature of God. Now, let's build on that together, because many times we really have this false image of God. I did that in my own life, the way I grew up and the religious system I was exposed to. I made a God out of the image I wanted him to be. And God's so good because he takes those blinders off. And I discovered, and I could look at in the scriptures and in my own personal experiences with God as well, I discovered that God was so much different than the God I had believed in. I believed in a God that was a rule maker, and if you broke the rules, then literally all hell was going to break loose. And so I was stuck in this loop of behavior and consequence and shame and guilt, and I was just totally stuck in that because of my false perception about who God is. I viewed him as the judge. I viewed him as a grumpy old man that took away fun. And as I came to know him better, I discovered he was quite a bit different than what I thought. So, you have any thoughts on that from your own experiences?
Well, first of all, I think that that's pretty common. And I can't say that I had as much of that. I felt like God was loving, but I just felt like somehow I didn't deserve it because of who I was. That I absolutely believed there was a God, but he was way far away from me, and that that didn't feel like there was anything I could do to ever earn that kind of love.
Yeah. And that's one of the blinders that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians. Shame is one of the biggest blinders that causes us to actually hide in the dark and hide ourselves instead of being able to be vulnerable and reveal. What we do is we hide and we create this false image of who we are. And we do that as a protection, and we do it as a way to seek this false sense of value in our lives. And we're all subject to that, and we all experience that. We're all in the same boat here.
Exactly.
So why don't you read out of 1 John 5, and we'll build off of this together.
Yeah, so these are verses 19 through 21. It says, "We know that we are children of God, and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. And we know that the Son of God has come, and he has given us understanding so that we can know the true God. Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts."
So this is a really powerful passage because it really describes much of the things that we've been talking about. So first of all, it makes a declaration of truth. We know we are the children of God. See, the blinders tells us we're not the children of God. Now, what happens when we start to believe that? We start to get a very religious mindset. It creates a religious mindset in us. And that's one way we seek value outside of the self instead of just accepting and living in inherent value. I call that outside in living versus inside out living. So when we have outside in living, we are trying to so much to seek and earn value that what we do is we become value takers. We become competitive, right? And we start comparing and competing, and we start condemning other people. And that's because we're value takers, because we don't feel like we have an inherent value. When we have inherent value, we actually can change the atmosphere that we function and live in. Because what we do is we become value givers. We're not trying to steal value or earn value. We know we have value. And so we become value givers. And we're going to talk about love here and the identity of God here in a second. But this is the best definition of love. If you only get one thing from this video today, get this definition of love. Love is the expressing and giving of value. And non-love is the taking of value in the dark, with manipulation, withholding, lying and deceiving, intimidation, and sometimes even violence. And the giving of value is so different from that because it's all above board. We don't give value because people have earned it. And we don't give value to manipulate people to get what we want. We simply give value because we understand the inherent value that every person holds because they are children of God. This is such a critical point. You have anything you want to add?
I would just say, along with that, manipulation is also a sense of control, which masquerades itself as what you think is love. And I can only say that because I did it for so many years, right? Where,
as we all do.
As we're, I'm trying to control the situations with my children or with Bud, and having altruistic motives are so I thought of trying to keep things in order, but really what it was about my own lack of identity and feeling unsafe. And so, again, living from the outside in instead of the inside out. So I think it bears saying this definition again because it really, to me, is a game changer when we think of how we're expressing God to one another. If God is love, is the giving of value, the expression of value to other people is love. And non-love or sin is the taking, robbing of value. That, to me, that kind of blows the lid off of this list of do's and don'ts.
Totally, right. And Paul talks about religion as just rules made by men. He says it's powerless. It's powerless to create change because all it does is try to deal with the symptom, which only reinforces shame and keeps us stuck in the very things we want to be freed from. So in this, let's go back to this 1 John passage. So the first thing it says is we know that we are children of God. That's the first thing we need to know. Because in that, God declares us valuable. That's the whole point. God's the value giver and he's the source of value. So as his children, we have inherent value, right? But then it says, but the whole world is under the control of the evil one. Now this is the system we talked about. This is that system. It's one of the existing kingdoms from a spiritual perspective that we see manifesting. This is a system of value taking. It's a system of value taking versus value giving in the world. And you can see the direct contrast of this. So again, this system that's under the control of the evil one, this system is all about rule making. We don't think of it this way, but it's a very religious system. People that are seeking value outside of the self, they must create a set of rules to live by so that they feel like they have control and they can see who's living up or not living up. Now this is crushing. This is crushing on the soul of the individual doing it, but it's also crushing on the soul of all those that are in relationship with this sort of system as well. And again, I'm not talking about necessarily religious people. Sometimes people that don't believe in God at all they set the harshest rules, and we've seen this happen politically. If you can apply this to history, we saw this with people like Hitler. He had a very rigid set of rules, and boy, if you didn't fit within those rules or his tribe, you were in big trouble. We saw this with Stalin and communist Russia as well. We saw this with Mao and communist China as well. And the ultimate value taking is imprisonment and death. And so this type of system has to be that way, because it's trying to redefine the very nature of mankind and womankind. And to enforce that, it has to be enforced with violence and intimidation. And so that's what it's talking about here. The whole world is under the control of the evil one. And it's a very controlling system, because it's the only way it can continue to exist, with this very rigid rule making. But then this passage goes on and says some really powerful things. That God has come in the form of Christ, and he has given us understanding so that we can know the true God. We can know God as he really is. Okay? Now, we're not going to read this, but it's in 1 John, and John describes the very nature of God. He says two things. He says God is love and God is light. So God is a value giver, he is love, and he is the source of love. Okay, this is very different from the God I grew up believing in. And sometimes our first image of God comes from our mom and dad as well, and so that's things that might need to be explored too, because when you're little, they are kind of God to you. You know?
Right.
They are. But God is a value giver, and he's light, he's transparent, he hasn't withheld anything. He is truth. And Jesus said, if you know the truth will set you free. And he is light, and light and truth are the same thing here in this passage. And Jesus is the light. He came to show the way, to illuminate the way, so that we can know the true God, who is love, as he's declared himself to be, as he has demonstrated himself to be. It's very easy to confuse the true God with what the world has presented God to be, with all its rule-making and control. And then, this is amazing to me. At the very end of this passage, John says something amazing. He says, "Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts." Okay. Now, what is he talking about here? He's talking about the religious concept of idol making, of idols. Now, an idol is anything outside of ourself where we seek value. Okay, I'm going to say that again. So remember, love is the expressing and giving of value, and non-love is the taking of value. So idol making is seeking of value outside of the self and our relationship with our true Father as children of God. Now, this can be money, it can be possessions, it can be people.
Right. Yeah, your children.
Your children, your spouse, yourself.
Any way in which you're trying to gain value.
Right, outside of the self.
Yeah.
And it's a really fragile thing. And here's the danger of it. We always end up hating our idols. Because they always disappoint us.
Right.
And we become slaves to them. We become enslaved to our idols because we're using them as a false sense of identity and of value. Now, this is the most important thing that Jesus came to do, was to correct this. That's why this passage we read, it says, he is the perfect image of God. He is the reflection of God the Father. That's why Jesus came, is to correct our view of the Father so that our very views of ourselves can be corrected, can be truthful. Now, here's the amazing thing that does. It shatters these rules made by men.
Yeah.
We no longer have a need to be oppressed by them and to obey them, because they are just a false sense of identity. Now, what that does, it's so beautiful. What that does is, now our behaviors, how we relate to one another, right? And what we express in how we relate to each other, it becomes a natural thing because our identity has been transformed. And remember, what is expressed on the outside is simply an expression of what is on the inside. If the image of God, which is love, is renewed in us, we naturally express value and love to people. It's not a work. We don't need a set of rules, because our rule now is love, which we are, that's renewed in us as our identity, because that is the image of the Father that he's renewing in us. And the previous two videos about redecorating your soul, this is what Scripture talks about. It's like, it says, take off that old set of clothes that is so much work. Jesus said, my yoke is light. He didn't say that what he asks us to do is a heavy thing. So we take off this heavy, lead-weighted set of rules and value seeking, which is a fragile self that hates itself and it lives in such pain and suffering and bondage. And instead, what we do is we take what Jesus has done on the cross. He didn't come to condemn the world. He came to set the captives free. And he's setting us free from that bondage. And he says, now put on this beautiful set of clothes, which is this gorgeous identity that is in the image of God the Father, which is truth and love. This frees us to be vulnerable and to really reveal ourselves to people without hiding or a need to appear to be perfect by following the rules. Right. And without looking at other people and saying, I'm going to compare myself to you, I'm going to compete with you, and I'm going to condemn you to make myself feel so much better. And people's lives and families and relationships have been crushed by this sort of thinking. We're seeing that happen right now with what's happening with all this self-righteousness that justifies so much hatred and bitterness in our very society today. So the takeaway from this is discover who the true God is. He's love. He's not a mean, grumpy judge. He's not a rule maker. His only rule is discover who you are in me and believe, so that you can find your true self and you can rediscover your good Father in heaven for who he really is and express him to the world. You have any thoughts in closing on that?
I think that a lot of people might say, well, yeah, I do believe these things, but yes, I still struggle. And I think that the beauty of that off-ramp analogy is that then it becomes just being honest, right? Confession just means tell the truth. And do that in the context of a community that you feel like you are honored and given value in. And then it becomes just the journey of walking this out day by day and expressing those struggles, being honest about when you fall, when you are competing with somebody or you are taking value from someone. Because we're all going to do this. So I think that the second part of that, of yes, knowing that God has done everything required for you to have value, period. But then when you forget that, which we all do, then come back to your community and be honest about it, because it's that light that somehow just dissipates the shame and the condemnation of all that, just speaking it out. So I feel like that's the biggest thing that has helped me, because I would have always said, yeah, of course God loves me, right? But I couldn't really live in that truth practically. So,
and which means being vulnerable and revealing our true self to God and what's happening in our life to God and other people,
right, that we can,
and that's that blinder of shame and condemnation that keeps us stuck in that.
Hidden, right. Absolutely.
And so it's Jesus' sacrifice is what sets us free from this religious thinking that we always need to make sacrifices for the non-love, for all the value taking we've done. Mm-hmm. And it's resting in that, and it frees us to stop paying such a dear price for what's been imparted to us. You'll see that in the first two videos. What's been imparted to us that actually has control of us. It sets us free from that. That's the off-ramp. That breaking of that shame and that self-condemnation and that self-talk that's so destructive. And I want to say a quick word to men here. Many times when I talk to men and I start talking about love, they shut off because somehow they feel like it's weakness. But what I want men to understand, this concept of giving and expressing value to your wife and your children is the most powerful weapon you could ever have to protect them, to enrich their lives. And it gives us a wonderful decision point about, what am I doing here? Is it giving value or taking value? Which frees me to explore what's underneath that's creating those situations.
That's a great place to end. And so we're going to encourage you guys, get on that off-ramp.
Get on the off-ramp.
Have a great day.
Thank you much.